Hello, everyone, and welcome in. Tonight, we are kicking off a four-part conversation series entitled Transformation Through Communication, Conversations with a Woman's Best Friend. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Crystal Fry, and I am a woman's best friend. As a personal identity coach, I specialize in transformation through communications with yourself, your spouse, your partner, really any relationship. And all transformation starts with communication. And that's exactly why we're here, because we want to talk about how we can implement, how we can start change, affect change. We know that's got to start with our words, with our communication. So our conversation for tonight is focused on civic engagement and how you can get involved. I personally am very honored to have our guest here tonight, City of Columbia Councilwoman Tamika Devine, who will share her thoughts and her perspective on the importance of civic engagement. And with that, Councilwoman Devine, I will turn it over to you for you to tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Crystal. It is a pleasure to be here, and welcome to all of you. It is indeed my honor to be here and hopefully share some of my insights and some knowledge and some action items for you. So as Crystal said, my name is Tamika Devine. I am an elected official. I'm on Columbia City Council. I was first elected in 2002. So I am in my 18th year of service. And when I was first elected, I was the youngest person at the time ever elected, the first African-American female to be elected to our city council, and the first African-American to be elected at large. And over my 18 years, I've served as mayor pro tem 3 times. And I also have a lot of national leadership boards like the National League of Cities, Women in Municipal Government, and Governing Women. In addition, I guess the jobs that pay the bills are, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a practicing attorney with my own law firm, Jabber and Isaac, where I practice primarily in real estate and probate matters. And then I also am a work-life integration strategist and consultant and speaker. And primarily my specialty is working with women professionals, working moms, to help them with leadership development and community engagement.
Fantastic. Well, it's quite obvious you wear many hats. And so, again, it is a pleasure to have you here tonight and for you to have your city councilwoman hat on and share some information with us on how we can get involved and why it's important for us to get involved. And I know that you are just a huge supporter of that. I mean, that's apparent. You've served 18 years so far. And being involved on that local level. And so what insight can you provide on the importance of getting involved and how getting involved can lead to change?
Well, I'll say, Crystal, that, we all have heard the saying, be the change that you want to see. And that is really so true, because a lot of times people don't recognize that the folks that are in elected or appointed positions, they're people just like us. They have experiences, they have life experiences, they have mindsets and ideologies that they bring to their decision making. And so if we want good decisions on those levels, we need a diversity of viewpoints there. And so that's why it is so important to be engaged. Whether you ever thought you might run for office or not, there's always a role for people to play. And I always tell people, there are those of us who choose to run for office. And to be quite honest, when I first ran for office, I never thought I'd run for office, but I was very passionate about very important issues to me. And what I realized is there was no one on our city council at the time that brought my views to the table. Like I mentioned, I was the first African-American female. And so I felt like, instead of just kind of complaining, I needed to get involved. And so I chose to run for office. But there are other things. Even if you don't choose to run for office, there are boards and commissions that make decisions that affect us. So that's a way to get civically engaged. There's advocacy, making sure that you communicate with your elected officials and your appointed officials so that they know kind of what your thoughts are, what your needs are in your community. And then if you're engaged on a civic level, not only does it make you a better citizen because you know more about your community and your state and what's happening, but you also know how to really affect the change that you want to see. So whether it's advocating for something new that you need, or whether it's stopping something that's bad that you don't need, those are all ways to be civically engaged, and it just depends on what role you want to play and how you let your voice be heard.
And I think that's an excellent point there. Several times throughout your response, I heard that thread of communication, being able to advocate for what it is that you want or need, or that you don't want, or that is no longer needed, how to speak up and use your voice, with whether you are the person who is in that spot as an elected official, or us as Joe citizen, I will say, making sure that we are in conversations with our elected officials to talk about the items that are important to us and our communities. So absolutely, that communication thread, I'm telling you, man, words, words, words. So with that, as we're talking on the local level, and just recently we had our local primary here in South Carolina. How do those local elections impact our communities?
So local elections are so very important. And I always tell people, every single election is important. Every single level of government is important, but you've got to know the roles of every level. And so when you think about the importance of the local level, and people say this too, and you've probably heard this saying that the government that's closest to the people, and that is really your local government. I mean, folks, I'm a mom, so I'm at PTO and I'm at church and I'm in the grocery store. And so, as opposed to, you may or may not know or see your congressperson, you probably know, or at least are in circles with your city council person or your county council person or your mayor, and they're really easily accessible. But it is so important because local government, we deal with everything from, roads and sidewalks in your community to, parks and rec services to parking services and small businesses, and law enforcement, which is, of course, a very hot topic right now that people are engaged in. And so your local government officials are the ones that make the policies and ordinances that really govern all those things, those real quality of life issues. And so that's why local government is so important. And local government has a role to play, as well as your state government and your federal government, but they all work together to make sure that we are all empowered to live really good lives. But if you're really looking at, what impacts your life every day, it is what your local government officials do. And that's why I really love local government, because I know that every single week when we meet and I cast a vote, I know my vote is going to impact a large group of the folks that, I go to church with and that I hang out with all the time.
Absolutely. And that leads perfectly into asking the question of how can we, as again, Joe citizen, and no offense to anyone named Joe, okay, just
or Jane citizen.
That's right, Joe or Jane citizen, yes. How can we, as the public, how can we better educate ourselves on local offices? I know that depending on where you live, whether you're inside city limits or outside of city limits, there's a different structure based on where you are. But how can we better educate ourselves on those local offices and how they impact the decisions that are made for our own individual communities?
That's a great question, Crystal. And I'd say there's several things that I would suggest that people do. The first thing I would say is go to a city council or county council meeting. Go see what they do. Look at their agendas and see what's on there. I will tell you that probably one of the frustrating parts for us as elected officials is we want our citizens to be engaged. We want y'all to communicate with us, but sometimes there are really, really important issues and no one even comes up there. And then like something might happen and then you're just trying to communicate with your elected officials and you really kind of don't know what we do. And so and when I say frustrating, it's not like it's a mad frustration, but it's like a frustration, like we want you to be engaged. We want you to understand the important role that every citizen has in, making good government. And so I'd start with, looking at agendas and, reading and going and showing up at community meetings. I'd also start with figuring out where your interests and where your passion are, and reach out to your local elected officials and see if they have a board or a commission that aligns with that passion. So my first entree into local government before I was elected to city council, I served on, our city has a commission on youth education Commission on Youth Education and Families. And at the time, I was very passionate about youth issues, youth engagement. And so I saw in the paper that they were looking for citizens to be on this committee, and I applied and I got appointed. And so we have things that run the gamut at the City of Columbia, from community development committees, advisory committees. We have committees that advise us on bicycle and pedestrian friendliness. We have committees that talk about the environment. And so, you know, you can volunteer for one of those committees, and then that gives you a better idea of what your local government does, but also how their policy is made. Because if you're in an advisory capacity, you will see your idea actually transform into actually law. And that is really exciting for folks. And then the last thing I would say is just reach out to your elected officials and get to know them, because that's a really good way to really kind of understand who's representing you, where they're, you know, where they might have some needs. And you can always, you know, certainly be an advocate for issues that are important to you that might come in front of your local board or commission or your council.
I think that you bring up a really interesting point there. And in that engagement, and as you were mentioning, in an advisory capacity, you know, having your idea, being able to watch it transform from an idea into law, you know, being able to watch that process, and something that, you know, maybe you sat around and thought was a good idea, being involved, being engaged, gives you that voice to be able to share that. And you're in that space where you can actually make a change. You can, you know,
Exactly.
create something and actually have it implemented. So, and we know that, well, I take that for granted. I say we know that laws get made, you know, through the. I'm always taken back to the Schoolhouse Rock, you know, a bill. The
Yes.
and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe that is actually the federal example, but it runs a pretty similar process on the state level, and how things go from a bill into becoming law. But with that, I want to ask what the difference is, so that we understand the difference between the local involvement, what happens at that local level, and what happens more at that state level.
That is an excellent question. So, because I will tell you that the reality is it is easier to get something passed on the local level. Now, mind you, the local level, their authority is just that, it's local. So it may not have, if your city council or your county council does something, it may not have statewide implications or, of course, federal implications, but it will really have community implications. And so it's easier to get things done. So again, another example just of kind of some of the things that we've seen, you know, in recent times in our country. You're hearing a whole lot about, you know, policy reforms and things that people want to see in law enforcement. And so you're probably seeing the federal government, of course, has introduced different legislation that they like to see. The state has a lot of states have introduced some things that they like to see. But you actually see local governments who have already, within the last several weeks, enacted different policies that affect their local law enforcement agency. So that's a huge example that, you know, something that may take a year in the federal government may take only a couple weeks in the local government. However, the local government only controls their law enforcement agency. So when you want to see the wide sweeping changes, you know, for all agencies nationally, of course, you definitely want that federal legislation because you'll have a uniform rule across the country. But until you can get there, it's good that your local government is able to actually address those things. And so, you know, that's probably the main difference. Another difference is local government, you typically do not have, well, you don't have like kind of the chambers. So, you know, on the state level and the federal level, you got the House and you got the Senate. You know, for your county council, your city council, and even school boards, I haven't mentioned those either, but even school boards, you have members and they're all part of one group. And so you don't have the large number, like well, it depends on where you are. So like if you're in New York, their city council is pretty large, but again, it's not different, it's not divided up into different chambers. And so everything that comes in front of them comes in front of all of them. And in a lot of local governments, you will find it to be nonpartisan. So that's also a way that you kind of see that things kind of get done quicker on a local level, because, what we always say, garbage pickup isn't a partisan issue. People don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, they just care that you're going to get their garbage picked up. And so sometimes it's a lot easier because you don't run into kind of that partisan bickering that you might have on the state and national level in local government.
And that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. I was thinking about that. Yeah, you're exactly right. I don't care, trash collection has nothing to do with which side of the aisle you decide to sit on, It's just a matter of, we need to get this done. How do we get it done? And I feel like that probably lends to better working relationships, on that local level. Not that our state and federal officials don't have good working relationships, but removing that partisanism from it, I think probably allows you to work a little quicker, push through things a little faster. Certainly maybe without as much agenda involved. So from your perspective, because you are very much and have been for quite some time involved on the local level, right now, what are you seeing as the top 3 issues that need immediate attention from a local perspective? So as people are looking around, in their own communities, in their own situations, what are the top 3 things that you're seeing that really need that attention from a local perspective?
Wow. And so I'd say most issues have a level, they have a role to play on each level. But I would say for local, and where I think we really can make some strides, is number one. I think probably one of the biggest issues is poverty, to include homelessness. That is an issue that it runs the gamut, and every city, small or large, has it at some level. But being able to address poverty in your community, and so how you're going to address that will certainly be indicative of how the services that you provide, whether it's affordable housing in your community, of course, homeless services in your community. Sometimes there's mental health that, will play a role in there. So I think that is probably the biggest issue that I think is dealing with poverty in communities. In addition to that, and I mentioned mental health, but on kind of to the other level, mental health is very important. And we know that over the last many years, state governments have cut funding to mental health centers and mental health treatment. And so it actually falls a lot on the local government to address, because it impacts our community in such a big way. And so I think mental health is going to have to be an issue that locally we all have to kind of work together, kind of figure out a solution for, and how do you address it. And then I guess I would say lastly is, especially in light of everything that's going on in our country, is understanding community reinvestment. And when I say community reinvestment, if you are investing your dollars and you're investing them wisely, then you certainly can address all issues from, education to poverty to building small businesses. And so, I think being able to invest the limited dollars that we have as a local government, but invest them wisely in reinvesting in the community so that it empowers the community to actually, make the community better, is a big issue that has got to have a lot of attention.
I think that is absolutely an excellent point. The fact of really reinvesting in the community to empower the community. I know personally, I live kind of far out removed. I'm definitely not within city limits at all. I would definitely be looking into my county council as opposed to city council, but my work experience takes me into the city, and being able to, I pass through many different communities on my way in, and just being able to see the differences. And, in downtown Columbia, over over the past, gosh, I would say the past 10 years, there's a huge difference in revitalizing Main Street and revitalizing the downtown area. And I've been in that area for quite a while. So being able to see what that looks like firsthand, I would have to agree 100%. You know, there's a different walk about people as you go through the process of reinvesting in the community and empowering them to become a part of that. I know that the mayor of Columbia has a community garden. Mayor Benjamin has a community garden. You know, they're within the community where, again, that's just one more example of that reinvestment into the community and allowing the people who live there to feel like they're more invested in their community, feel like, you know, I think it raises pride of ownership when you see, you know, from a local level that you're reinvesting in that community. I think it gives the residents there a feeling that you know, that they matter, that they're cared about, that they're noticed, that they're recognized. And I think that that is, I feel like that's one of the ways that people come together to impact change, to affect change. When you, especially on that local, that very granular community level, and we all know that each community has its own issues to deal with, but I feel like when you create that space and the community knows that it's local officials, that, you know, the people that they have elected to represent them are pouring back into the community, I think that builds a stronger bond within the community. And I think that creates better outcomes, if you will. You know,
Exactly.
stronger community, better outcomes for sure. So with all of that, I've got to ask, where does one start? How does one go about getting involved?
So it again, you've got to figure out from yourself and kind of what you talked about, what you do, the conversations that you have, the communication that you have, and you mentioned including the communications that you have with yourself. You need to start with yourself and kind of figure out, where do I want to get involved? At what level do I want to get involved? And you can easily start by just volunteering to, you know, like I mentioned, the boards or commissions or something like that. You can start just that basic as to, you know, reaching out and saying, hey, I want to serve. Where can I better serve? You know, a perfect example is, you know, you mentioned our primary. So we had a huge fiasco with our primary. You know, people were in line for hours. There were, you know, people got wrong ballots. I mean, all day Tuesday and Wednesday, that's all I heard from citizens who were just frustrated with the process. I'm a very action oriented person, and I'm always telling people, okay, you channel that energy, that frustration, whatever it is you're feeling, and channel that into an action item and figure out what can you do, because we can all do something. It just depends on what it is. And so, you know, I share it with people. I'm like, you know, one of the issues was in the midst of coronavirus, and knowing that most poll workers are elderly retired folks, and they're in that vulnerable population. So a lot of them chose not to work this election. You had, you know, you didn't have as many poll workers, and that caused a huge issue. So I said, you know, I told people who are frustrated, you know, what about taking the day off in November or another election and volunteer to be a poll worker? So that's a good way that people who are frustrated about the voting process can actually see themselves doing something to make it better. So same thing with boards or commissions, you can start by volunteering there. You again figure out what your passion is, and then find out, based on what your passion is, what does your, you know, your county council, city council, or even again school board, what do they have that might speak to that passion? You know, I know several people who are very passionate about the environment. And so again, I mentioned we've got a Climate Protection Act committee where people actually serve, and they give us recommendations on things that we in the city need to do to be more sustainable. And so that's a passion of people. Some of those people will never ever want to run for office. They don't want to be the elected official, but they want to affect the system and do it in a way that actually speaks to their talents. So figuring out what your passion is, where your talents lie, and see what aligns in your local government where you might could even volunteer or be in an advisory capacity.
I think that's excellent. And one before we wrap up, is there anywhere I would imagine that most local offices, whether it's city council or county council or even the school board, I would imagine that they all have some type of online resource, how to contact them. Are you aware of any one central place, or is that more localized? Is that more like, if I'm in this county, I need to really kind of just Google search, this county council, Richland County Council, and let that guide my search into how to get involved. Is that kind of the best way to go
Yes.
about that?
Yes, exactly. You're right. It's very local because it kind of depends on where you are. But pretty much everybody should have a website. And so, yes, Google, go to their website, and it should tell you who your representatives are and more specifically how to get in touch with them, which I'd say is huge, Crystal. I can't tell you how many people I speak to who do not know who their elected representatives are. And so kind of maybe also to go back to your answer, your question as to what can people do, where do we start? One of the things I'd say start with, just know who your elected officials are, because that's one thing. I have so many folks who do not know who their elected officials are. So you actually don't know if you've got a good representative or not because you don't know who it is. So at least find out who they are. Most places have a website where you can go in. I know like here in Richland County, if you go to Richland, their website is richlandonline.com. If you go to richlandonline.com, there's a place that you can go in and you can put in your address, and it'll tell you who your city representative is if you're in the city. And if you're not in the city, it'll tell you you're in an unincorporated area, which means you're not in the city. But it'll tell you who your county council person is. It'll tell you who your state house member and senator is. And it'll tell you who your federal house member and senator is. And so that's a good place to start, is just to know who your representatives are so that you know when you have an issue, how do you reach out to them? And then if you want to reach out to them, you're going to have to then go to their whatever governing body they have, go to their website. So if you're trying to reach out to your federal officials, then go to their office, and you'll see how to contact your House of Representative member, or how to contact your senator.
That's excellent. And while you were saying that, it occurred to me that another place where people can look to find who their different representatives are, whether it's county council, city council, whoever it is that they would be voting for in an election, is for South Carolina, it's SC Vote, the voter registration website. If you go there, when you said put your address, and I went, oh yeah, you can do that there too. Yeah. Type in your address and it'll pull it up from the local, even the school district. It'll pull that up for you, which is important because, like you said, if you don't know who your representative is, it's hard to know whether or not they're in line with what your views are, with what you want to see happening in your community, if you don't know who they are. So excellent point. When we are informed, we have knowledge and education to make better decisions. So
definitely.
I'm a huge proponent of that. Knowledge is indeed power. It allows you to consider different options. The more you know, the better decisions you can make. So with that, I do want to thank you so very much for spending your time here with us tonight. It has been my absolute pleasure, and want to give you yield the floor once again to see if you have any final thoughts to share before we close out.
Oh, thank you so much. I just want to say I'm honored that you asked me to speak. This is, as you can tell, this is something I'm really passionate about, just because I know what good government looks like. And I know that good government starts with informed, educated, and engaged citizens. And so I thank you for doing this, because especially like I mentioned, the last few weeks, I've had so many conversations with citizens who just are clueless as to where to start to affect change, how to get in touch with their elected official, anything. And so this is really great information, and I'm glad you're doing this. What I would just say is that, everybody has a role to play. And like I mentioned before, not everybody wants to be an elected official. Not everybody like thinks about politics the way I do, but everybody wants a good quality of life. And the way you make sure that you and your neighborhood and your children and your grandchildren have a good quality of life is to make sure that you have government that's working for you. And one of the biggest things that I get, a little disheartened about is when I hear people say, my vote doesn't matter or government doesn't work. I've been there, I've seen it. I've seen government that doesn't work and I've seen government that works. And again, the working government, the best working government start with the citizens. So figure out what role you want to play and then just get out there and start getting involved.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And I've heard that same, oh, my vote doesn't matter. Well, if everyone says my vote doesn't matter and nobody votes, I'm also a big fan of, you can't complain about what you have if you don't go vote.
Right.
You can't complain about what you've got because you didn't do your part. So yes, I think we're on the same page there. Involvement. That is what we're striving for. Increasing our civic engagement, increasing our community involvement so that we can effect change locally and then let that spread. And I think that's where it starts. People say if you want to change the world, if you want to change other things, you first start with self because, that's where it all begins. It begins with us. And so by getting it more involved in your community, by being more engaged with what's happening on a local and a state and federal level, but definitely starting there in the local, we certainly can move forward with impacting change. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you will be joining us again. Again, this is a 4-part conversation series entitled Transformation Through Communication, Conversations with a Woman's Best Friend.